I typed an anonymous code into locker 17 at my building and found $70,000 in cash. Next to the money, an encrypted flash drive and a key tagged with the words, Aurora, Colorado, as if someone knew exactly where my life was about to explode. In that moment, standing in the empty hallway at 11 at night, with the brown box in my hands, and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my existence was a lie. My name is Rachel Miller. I'm 32 years old, and exactly 3 weeks ago, I discovered my husband in my bed with my best friend. 2 weeks ago, I lost my job in a restructuring too convenient to be coincidence. 1 week ago, I rented a room in a cheap co-living space in East Austin because my savings were melting faster than ice cream in July Texas heat. And now, on this Thursday night that should have been just another miserable night of scrolling LinkedIn for jobs, I'm holding a fortune in cash and a message from my godmother who died 6 months ago. If you've ever lost everything at once, you know what I'm talking about. That free-fall sensation where there's no ground, just air and panic, where every second feels like eternity, and you can't breathe right because the entire world flipped upside down without warning. That's exactly how I felt when I opened my apartment door that Tuesday afternoon and saw Daniel, my husband of 4 years, tangled up with Kayla Pierce, the woman I met in college, who was my maid of honor, who held my hand when my mother died. Her perfume still hung in the air, his clothes thrown on my bedroom floor. The expression on their faces wasn't guilt, it was irritation, as if I'd interrupted something important by arriving at my own home 3 hours earlier than usual. Daniel didn't even try to deny it. He sat on the edge of the bed, my bed, and said we needed to talk about our arrangement, that things had changed, that he and Kayla shared a connection he never had with me. He used the word connection like it was something sacred, something that justified everything. Kayla pulled on her blouse hurriedly and muttered something about bad timing before walking out the door, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and cheap humiliation. I stood there, frozen, while Daniel kept talking, explaining that he'd already consulted a lawyer, that it would be better for both of us to move forward, that he didn't want to complicate things. The coldness in his voice was terrifying, like he was terminating a contract, not a marriage. In the following 2 weeks, my life collapsed in slow motion. Daniel brought divorce papers signed by a lawyer I'd never heard of, demanding I leave the apartment that was in his name, claiming my financial contributions had been minimal. Kayla blocked my number and disappeared from social media. At work, my supervisor scheduled an unexpected meeting to inform me the company was downsizing and my position was being eliminated, offering 2 weeks' notice and an awkward handshake. Everything happened too fast to process, too coordinated to be chance. I packed my things on a Friday afternoon while Daniel watched from the doorway with an impatient expression, as if I was delaying his plans. I loaded 3 suitcases and 2 boxes into my car and drove to the co-living I found on Craigslist, a tiny room with a shared bathroom and thin walls where I could hear the neighbor coughing at 3 a.m. That first night in that place was the worst of my life. Lying on a thin mattress that smelled like industrial detergent, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to understand how I'd gotten there. At 32 years old, with a finance degree, 4 years of fintech experience, a clean record and hard work, I was unemployed, divorcing, betrayed, and living in a room that felt like a college dorm. I cried until I had no more tears, until my eyes burned and my throat hurt. And then, when I thought it couldn't get worse, my phone buzzed with a notification from the building app. Automated message informing me I had a delivery at locker 17. Access code 604921. I hadn't even ordered anything. I went down the stairs at 11 at night, barefoot, still in the clothes I wore to pack up my life. The hallway was empty, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed softly. The row of metal lockers on the wall, numbered 1 through 24, all locked and silent. I typed the code into the keypad on locker 17. And the door opened with a soft click. Inside, a brown box with no shipping label, no sender, just my name written by hand in black pen. Handwriting I recognized immediately. Ruth Navarro, my godmother, my mother's older sister, the woman who died 6 months ago in a car accident that never made sense to me. I grabbed the box with trembling hands and went back upstairs without looking back, with the strange feeling of being watched. I locked the door, sat on the floor, and opened the box. The mall. Money came first. Organized stacks of $100 bills. 70,000 total. More money than I'd ever seen together in my life. Under the money, a black flash drive with a handwritten label saying only open alone. And lastly, a heavy metal key with a yellow tag hanging from it, number engraved on the surface, and an address in Aurora, Colorado, written in Ruth's same handwriting. At the bottom of the box, a white envelope. I opened it with fingers that shook so badly I almost tore the bow. Paper. The letter was short, written in Ruth's precise handwriting, the same script I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes throughout my childhood. Rachel, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you're in danger. Everything that's happening to you right now, the divorce, losing your job, Kayla's betrayal, none of it is accident. Daniel Brooks isn't who you think he is. He never was. Your mother didn't die in a random car crash on I-35. She was murdered because she discovered something that powerful people wanted buried. I've spent the last 2 years of my life collecting evidence, building a case, protecting assets in your name so you'd have resources to fight back. The money in this box is yours. The flash drive contains everything you need to know. The key opens a storage container in Aurora with documents your mother compiled before she died. Trust no one in Austin. Not Daniel, not Kayla, not anyone from your old life. But trust this, you are not weak. You are not broken. And you are not alone. Finish what Linda started. Make them pay. The letter was signed with Ruth's full name and dated 3 days before her accident. I read it 7 times, each time feeling my understanding of reality shift further. My hands had stopped shaking. Something cold and clear was settling in my chest, replacing the grief and confusion with razor-sharp focus. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, entered the password Ruth had written at the bottom of the letter, my mother's birthday backwards, and waited while files loaded. What appeared on my screen made my blood run cold. Folders organized by date, by company name, by person. Atlas MedTech prominently featured. Video files, audio recordings, scanned documents, spreadsheets with numbers highlighted in red, and photographs, hundreds of photographs, including one that made me stop breathing. My mother, Linda Vaughn, standing between 2 men at what looked like a medical conference. The banner behind them read FDA Technical Review Summit Denver, dated 4 years ago. The man on her left was Grant Mercer, CEO of Atlas MedTech, a company I recognized from news articles about innovative cardiac devices. The man on her right, younger, smiling, his hand casually on my mother's shoulder, was Daniel Brooks. My Daniel. Except this photo was taken 2 years before he supposedly met me by chance at a coffee shop in Austin. 2 years before our first date. 2 years before he told me he was a risk management consultant who traveled for work. The timestamp on the photo proved he was lying about when we met, which meant he was lying about how we met, which meant everything about our relationship was constructed, intentional, planned. I felt my stomach turn. The coffee I'd drunk earlier threatened to come back up. I ran to the shared bathroom down the hall and barely made it to the toilet before I vomited, my entire body rejecting this new reality. When I came back to my room, I locked the door again and sat down to systematically go through every file on that drive. Hours passed. The sun started rising outside my window. I didn't move except to take notes, filling pages of a notebook with names, dates, connections, questions. By the time morning light filled my tiny room, I understood exactly what Ruth had left me. Evidence of massive fraud, proof of conspiracy, documentation of my mother's murder, and a roadmap for revenge. The files showed that Atlas MedTech had developed something called the Sentinel Stent, an intelligent cardiac device with telemetry capabilities that transmitted patient data to a smartphone app. Revolutionary technology, early FDA approval, massive market potential. Except the clinical trial data was falsified. My mother, who worked as a technical auditor contracted by the FDA, had discovered discrepancies in adverse event reporting. Patients were experiencing complications, serious ones, including 3 deaths that were never properly attributed to device failure. She'd started compiling evidence, flagging inconsistencies, preparing a report that would have triggered a full investigation and likely a recall. That's when things got dangerous for her. The audio files were damning. Recorded Zoom calls between Grant Mercer and his executive team, discussing how to neutralize Linda's investigation. They used that exact word, neutralize, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person doing her job. They talked about hiring consultants to discredit her findings, about applying pressure through regulatory channels, about finding leverage. In one recording dated 8 months before my mother's death, a voice I now recognized as Daniel's suggested a different approach, something about building relationships, gathering intelligence, creating contingencies. My skin crawled listening to him speak, that smooth, confident tone I'd fallen in love with, deployed as a weapon against my family. Another folder contained financial records showing payments from a consulting firm called Whitfield Advisory to Daniel Brooks, substantial payments, $47,000 over 18 months, for services described only as stakeholder management and risk mitigation. The dates aligned perfectly with our relationship timeline. He'd been paid to get close to me, to monitor what I knew, to control what information I had access to. Every date, every conversation, every intimate moment we shared had been part of his job. The realization hit me like physical pain. I'd been so carefully played, so thoroughly manipulated, that I'd never once suspected. I thought about all the times he'd asked casual questions about my mother's work, about Ruth's health, about family documents, questions that seemed like normal curiosity, but were actually intelligence gathering. Kayla's involvement became clear in the email threads. She worked in accounting at a subsidiary of Atlas MedTech, something I'd known but never thought twice about. The emails showed her providing internal information, flagging when I mentioned anything work-related, reporting my mother's condition during her final months. She'd been feeding them information for over 3 years, long before Daniel came into my life. My best friend, the woman I'd trusted completely, had been watching me, reporting on me, betraying me from the very beginning of our friendship. Every secret I'd shared, every vulnerable moment, every piece of my life I'd opened to. Her, she'd documented and passed along. The depth of the deception was suffocating. I found my mother's accident report in another folder. Official police documentation saying she lost control of her vehicle on I-35 during a rainstorm, hydroplaned, struck a barrier, died on impact. But Ruth had included additional materials, photos of the crash scene that showed brake line damage inconsistent with impact, a mechanic's report from a shop my mother had visited 2 days before her death, documenting that her brakes had been inspected and were in perfect condition, testimony from a witness who saw another vehicle following my mother closely before the accident, but couldn't identify the make or model. Cell phone records showing my mother had called Ruth 17 times in the week before she died, calls that lasted over an hour, calls where she was presumably sharing what she'd discovered, and a draft email my mother had written but never sent, addressed to a journalist at the Western Ledger, outlining her findings and requesting protection. She'd known she was in danger. She'd tried to save herself. They killed her anyway. By 8 a.m, I'd absorbed everything on that flash drive. The rage I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Not hot and explosive, but cold and focused, crystallizing in my chest like ice. I understood now why Ruth had left me money. This wasn't going to be quick or easy. Fighting back against people with this much power and resources would require time, strategy, careful planning, and financial independence. I couldn't work a normal job while building a case against them. I needed to disappear from their radar, make them think I was broken and defeated, while I systematically dismantled everything they'd built. The money would buy me that time. The evidence would give me ammunition, and the fury burning in my veins would give me strength. I made 3 decisions in that moment, sitting on the floor of my shabby room, with dawn light streaming through dirty windows. First, I would go to Aurora and see what else my mother and Ruth had left me. Second, I would not confront Daniel or Kayla or anyone else until I had every piece in place. And third, I would make absolutely certain that when I struck, it would be devastating, complete, and irreversible. They'd taken everything from me, my family, my trust, my life. I would take everything from them, their freedom, their reputation, their future, not out of spite, but out of justice, because my mother deserved justice, because other families deserve protection from their lies, and because I'd be damned if I let them get away with murder. I packed my car before noon, throwing clothes into a duffel bag without caring what I grabbed, loading my laptop and the box from Ruth into the trunk under a blanket. I left my phone on the nightstand, powered off, because I'd read enough spy novels to know they could track it. At a gas station on the edge of Austin, I bought a burner phone with cash, the kind drug dealers use in movies, and programmed in only one number, a lawyer Ruth had mentioned in her notes. Then I pointed my car north and drove. 15 hours to Denver with stops only for gas and bathroom breaks, eating granola bars and drinking bad coffee, my mind racing faster than the speedometer. The landscape changed from Texas flatlands to New Mexico desert to Colorado mountains, and with each mile, I felt myself transforming from victim to something else, something harder and more dangerous. Aurora was a sprawl of industrial parks and logistics centers east of Denver, the kind of place where warehouses stretched for blocks and semi-trucks idled in parking lots at all hours. I found the storage facility at 2 a.m, a massive complex surrounded by chain-link fence with security cameras mounted every 50 feet. The key Ruth left me opened Gate 7. I drove through, following signs to the container section, massive metal, boxes stacked like building blocks. Number 847 was in the back corner, isolated from the others. My hands shook again as I unlocked it, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. The door swung open with a metallic groan. Inside was an archive that took my breath away. Metal shelving units lined both walls, packed with labeled boxes, binders, file folders, all organized with Ruth's characteristic precision. A folding table held a laptop, still plugged into a portable power station. A cot in. The corner suggested Ruth had spent nights here, working, organizing, preparing. The air smelled like paper and determination. I stepped inside and pulled the door partially closed behind me, then turned on the battery-powered lantern sitting on the table. The laptop powered up when I pressed the button. No password required. Desktop background a photo of Ruth and my mother as young women, laughing, alive, whole. I started with the boxes labeled Trial Data Analysis. Inside were printouts of clinical trial results for the Sentinel stent, the official versions submitted to the FDA, and beside them, different versions, earlier drafts that showed the real numbers. My mother had somehow obtained both. The contrast was staggering. The official data showed a 94% success rate with minimal adverse events. The real data showed 73% success rate with significant complications including blood clots, infection, and device migration. 3 deaths in the trial. Group that were classified in the official version as unrelated to the device, cardiac events, natural causes. But the earlier drafts clearly linked them to stent failure. Someone had systematically altered the data, changed classifications, removed incidents, transformed failure into success. The next box contained email chains between Grant Mercer and someone named Dr. Harrison Caldwell, who I learned from Ruth's notes was the principal investigator for the trial. They discussed adjusting event classifications, removing outlier data points, reframing complications as pre-existing conditions. Dr. Caldwell expressed concern initially, saying the alterations crossed ethical lines, but Mercer responded with reminders about research funding, future grants, career advancement. By the end of the chain, Caldwell was suggesting the changes himself. I felt sick reading it. These were medical professionals, people who'd taken oaths to do no harm, deliberately falsifying safety data for profit. Another section held documentation about the consultant network Atlas MedTech used to manage problems. Whitfield Advisory appeared prominently, run by a man named Preston Whitfield, former intelligence operative turned corporate fixer. His company specialized in what they called reputation management and stakeholder relations, which apparently meant surveillance, blackmail, and elimination of threats. The invoices were coded, but Ruth had decoded them in margins with her neat handwriting. $47,000 to Daniel Brooks for relationship cultivation and intelligence gathering regarding Linda Vaughn's daughter. $32,000 to Kayla Pierce for sustained monitoring and reporting. $85,000 to a name I didn't recognize for automotive intervention, dated 1 week before my mother's death. That last one made my vision blur with rage. I found the surveillance reports Daniel had filed. Monthly summaries of our life together, clinical and cold. Subject remains unaware of mother's investigation. Subject discusses career frustrations. No indication of suspicious activity. Subject planning wedding. Emotionally dependent. No risk factor. Reading about my own life narrated like an intelligence briefing was surreal and devastating. He'd documented our intimate moments, my vulnerabilities, my fears and hopes, all filed away as data points. One report noted that I'd mentioned wanting to go through my mother's office files after her death, and recommended accelerating marriage timeline to gain legal access and control. We got engaged 2 weeks later. I'd thought it was romantic. It was strategic. The most damning evidence was in a folder marked contingency planning. It contained scenarios for different outcomes, risk assessments, action items. If Linda Vaughn submits FDA report, initiate option 3. If Ruth Navarro continues investigation, implement option 5. If Rachel Miller becomes problematic, deploy option 7. I flipped to the appendix where options were defined. Option 3 was regulatory pressure and discrediting. Option 5 was fatal accident. Option 7 was isolation protocol, remove support structure, induce financial crisis, maintain surveillance. They'd planned my destruction months in advance. The divorce, the job loss, Kayla's betrayal, all of it orchestrated as part of option 7. I was living through a script they'd written for me, but Ruth had left me something they hadn't planned for. In a locked drawer of the table, I found a key and a note saying trust fund documentation and property deeds, safety deposit box 472, First National Bank, Denver, in your name, credentials attached. The credentials were a account number and PIN. Ruth had been moving money for 2 years, transferring assets, creating a financial foundation they couldn't touch because they didn't know it existed. She'd built me a war chest. The exact amount wasn't listed, but the quarterly statements showed holdings in real estate, dividend-producing stocks, and a royalty stream from patents my mother had filed years ago. Conservative estimate, over $2 million, all structured in trusts and LLCs that made me functionally invisible to normal searches. I sat in that storage container as the sun rose outside, reading through everything twice, making notes, photographing pages with the burner phone, absorbing the full scope of what I'd inherited. Not just evidence, but a complete battle plan. Ruth had documented everything, connected every dot, created a roadmap for prosecution. She'd identified weak points in their conspiracy, individuals who might flip, regulatory bodies with jurisdiction, journalists who could be trusted. She'd even drafted the complaint that should be filed with the Department of Justice, a 100-page document with exhibits and citations that read like a legal brief. My mother had discovered the fraud. Ruth had built the case, and now it was my job to finish it. The laptop had one more file I hadn't opened yet, a video titled For Rachel, dated the week before Ruth's accident. I clicked play. Ruth's face filled the screen, older than I remembered, tired but determined. Rachel, sweetheart, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't stop them before they took your mother. Sorry I couldn't protect you better. Sorry I had to leave you with this burden, but I couldn't let them win. Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew. She could have walked away, kept quiet, stayed safe, but she saw people being hurt by faulty devices and falsified data, and she couldn't live with that. She chose truth over safety, and they killed her for it. Ruth's voice cracked. I've spent every day since trying to make it right, collecting evidence, building this case, protecting resources so you'd have options. The money I've set aside, it's yours. No strings, no conditions. Use it to live, to heal, to disappear if that's what you need. But if you want to fight, if you want to finish what Linda started, everything you need is in this container. Names, evidence, contacts, strategy. I've laid the groundwork. I just couldn't live long enough to execute it. That falls to you now. Ruth leaned closer to the camera. Listen to me carefully. These people are dangerous. They've killed twice already. They won't hesitate to kill again if you threaten them. So if you're going to do this, do it smart. Don't confront them directly. Don't tip your hand. Build your case in secret, then strike all at once, overwhelmingly, with enough force that they can't recover. Use the media. Use law enforcement. Use regulatory agencies. Hit them from every angle simultaneously so they can't spin the narrative. And Rachel, her expression softened. Don't do this for revenge. Do it for justice. Do it so other families don't lose their mothers to corporate greed. Do it because it's right. But know that once you start, you can't stop halfway. You're either all in or all out. Choose carefully. The video ended with Ruth smiling sadly. I love you, sweetheart. Your mother loved you. We both wanted better for you than this. But here we are. Make us proud. I sat in silence after the video ended, tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, but from clarity. For 3 weeks I'd been drowning in confusion and pain, unable to understand why my life had exploded. Now I knew, and knowing changed everything. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a weapon they'd accidentally armed. They'd given me motive by killing my mother. They'd given me means by forcing Ruth to hide assets. And Ruth had given me opportunity by collecting evidence they didn't know existed. The only question left was whether I had the courage to use what I'd been given. I thought about my mother choosing truth over safety. I thought about Ruth spending her final years building this case, knowing it might cost her life. I thought about other families, other patients, other people who'd trusted Atlas MedTech and suffered because of falsified data. The decision wasn't hard. It was the easiest decision I'd ever made. I would finish this. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but methodically, carefully, completely. I would follow Ruth's roadmap, use every resource she'd left me, strike from every angle she'd identified, and I would not stop until Grant Mercer, Daniel Brooks, Preston Whitfield, Dr. Harrison Caldwell, Kayla Pierce, and every single person involved in this conspiracy faced consequences for what they'd done. My mother deserved justice, Ruth deserved vindication, and I deserved the satisfaction of watching them fall. I packed up the most critical documents, locked the container, and drove into Denver as the city woke up. My first stop would be the bank to access the trust fund. My second would be a lawyer. My third would be the beginning of the end for Atlas MedTech. The bank manager looked at me like I'd walked in from another century when I presented Ruth's credentials and asked to access safety deposit box 472. I probably looked homeless, wearing 3-day-old clothes, hair unwashed, eyes red from crying and rage. But the account number matched, the PIN worked, and suddenly his expression shifted from suspicion to deference. He led me to a private room where the box waited, long and metal and heavy with secrets. Inside, exactly what Ruth promised: trust documents, property deeds, stock certificates, and a leather portfolio containing instructions for accessing accounts. The quarterly statement showed $2.3 million in assets, structured across 7 different entities, none traceable to me through normal searches. Ruth had made me rich and invisible simultaneously. I sat in that sterile room, reading through trust documents, and felt my first moment of hesitation. This money represented safety. I could take it, disappear, start over somewhere far from Texas and Colorado, and everything that hurt. New name, new city, new life. Let the dead stay dead, and the guilty stay free. Live quietly, comfortably, unknown. The temptation whispered seductively, "You've lost enough already. You've suffered enough. You don't owe anyone anything. Just walk away." But then I thought about my mother's face in that conference photo, professional and proud, doing work she believed in. I thought about Ruth spending her final years in a storage container, organizing evidence instead of enjoying retirement. I thought about patients trusting doctors who'd falsified safety data. The hesitation dissolved. My next stop was the lawyer Ruth had recommended, Maria Torres, who operated out of a modest office in downtown Denver. Her assistant tried to turn me away at first. No appointment. But when I mentioned Ruth Navarro's name, Maria appeared immediately. She was shorter than I expected, maybe 50 years old, sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, the kind of woman who missed nothing. We spoke for 3 hours. I showed her everything: the flash drive, contents, the storage container inventory, Ruth's video, the trust documents. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "What you have here is extraordinary," she said. "Enough evidence to trigger federal investigation, probably criminal prosecution, certainly civil litigation. But Rachel, you need to understand what you're starting. These people have resources, connections, expensive lawyers. They'll fight back hard. They'll investigate you, dig up everything about your life, try to discredit you publicly. They'll make you wish you'd stayed quiet." I felt cold clarity settle over me. "They killed my mother," I said. "They murdered Ruth. They sent Daniel to spy on me and Kayla to betray me. They've already taken everything I had. What exactly am I supposed to be afraid of losing?" Maria smiled then, predatory and pleased. "Good," she said, "because we're going to destroy them." Maria outlined the strategy Ruth had drafted. First, establish chain of custody for all evidence, document everything, create multiple backups in secure locations. Second, approach the Western Ledger, a nonprofit journalism consortium that specialized in corporate malfeasance investigations. Give them exclusive access to coordinate public exposure with legal action. Third, file complaints with FDA, Department of Justice, and Senate Oversight Committee simultaneously, overwhelming them with coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Fourth, identify potential witnesses inside Atlas MedTech who might cooperate in exchange for immunity. Fifth, prepare for the counterattack by documenting everything about my own life, leaving no vulnerabilities they could exploit. The timeline would be months, not weeks. Patience was essential. I rented a small apartment in Denver under an LLC name, paid 6 months up front in cash, and settled in to become someone different. Every morning I woke at 5 and worked through Ruth's files, cross-referencing names, dates, transactions. I learned the structure of Atlas MedTech inside and out, memorized executive bios, studied their corporate history, identified weak points. Dr. Harrison Caldwell worried me most. The email chains showed him expressing ethical concerns before ultimately capitulating. That meant he had a conscience, which meant he might be flippable. Maria agreed to reach out through back channels, feeling out whether he'd cooperate. The Western Ledger sent 2 investigative journalists to meet with me, a woman named Sarah Chen and a man named Marcus Reed. They spent a week in Denver reviewing everything, asking detailed questions, verifying facts, cross-checking sources. Sarah focused on the medical side, interviewing patients who'd received the Sentinel stent, documenting complications that matched the hidden trial data. Marcus followed the money, tracing payments from Atlas MedTech through Whitfield Advisory to Daniel and Kayla. Watching them work was educational. They were meticulous, skeptical, unwilling to publish anything they couldn't independently confirm. Good journalism took time. Meanwhile, I started having dreams about my mother. Not nightmares exactly, but memories twisted into something haunting. Her voice on the phone during our last conversation, saying she was working on something important that might take a while. The way she'd seemed distracted at Christmas, distant, like her mind was somewhere else. The sudden urgency when she'd asked me to keep certain documents safe, files I'd stored without looking at them. I'd been so wrapped up in my own life, my job, my relationship with Daniel, that I'd missed the signs she was in danger. The guilt sat heavy in my chest. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected her. Kayla started texting my old number, messages that piled up while the phone sat powered. Off in Austin. Maria had someone monitoring it remotely, collecting evidence. The messages started apologetic, saying she was sorry, that things had gotten complicated, that she never meant to hurt me. But after 2 weeks of no response, the tone changed. Defensive, then angry, then threatening. "You're being dramatic," one message said. "Daniel and I are good together. You need to accept that and move on." Another said, "People are asking about you, wondering where you went. Stop being childish and answer your phone." The final message, sent at 2 a.m, said, "You're making a mistake staying away. Come back and we can work this out." The desperation in her words told me they were worried, uncertain where I'd gone, what I knew, what I might do. Daniel was harder to read because he didn't reach out at all. No calls, no texts, no emails, complete radio silence. That scared me more than Kayla's messages because it meant he was disciplined, professional, still treating me like an asset, to be managed rather than a person he'd betrayed. Maria warned me to stay alert, vary my routines, watch for surveillance. Preston Whitfield's company specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. If they realized I'd accessed Ruth's evidence, they'd come looking. I started noticing details, cars that appeared too often, faces I'd seen before, the prickling sensation of being watched, paranoia or justified caution. I couldn't tell anymore. 3 months into my preparation, Dr. Caldwell agreed to cooperate. Maria brokered the deal, immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony and access to original trial data he'd kept as insurance. He was terrified, she reported, convinced they'd kill him like they killed your mother. We had to guarantee protection, relocate his family, offer witness security, but he's ready to talk. That breakthrough changed everything. With Caldwell's testimony corroborating Ruth's evidence, we had an airtight case. The Western Ledger, scheduled publication. Maria finalized complaints for filing, and I prepared mentally for the moment everything would explode into public view. The Western Ledger published on a Tuesday morning, front page of their website, headlines screaming, "Medical device maker, falsified safety data, patients died." Sarah Chen's byline above 6,000 words of meticulous reporting, complete with leaked documents, whistleblower testimony, and patient interviews. Within an hour, every major news outlet picked it up. CNN ran breaking news alerts. The New York Times started their own investigation. Twitter exploded with outrage. I watched from my Denver apartment, laptop open, refreshing news sites obsessively, feeling vindication and terror in equal measure. This was real now. Irreversible. The machine I'd set in motion couldn't be stopped. Atlas MedTech's stock dropped 32% before trading was halted. Grant Mercer issued a statement denying everything, calling the article a coordinated attack by competitors, threatening lawsuits against the Western Ledger for defamation. But his denial rang hollow because the evidence was too strong, too detailed, too well documented. The FDA announced an immediate investigation within hours. The Senate Oversight Committee scheduled emergency hearings for the following week. Department of Justice opened a criminal inquiry. Everything was happening faster than Maria had predicted. Public outrage creating momentum that accelerated timelines. Politicians wanted to be seen taking action. Regulators couldn't ignore the pressure, and prosecutors smelled blood in the water. Dr. Caldwell's televised interview aired that evening. Prime time. His face obscured but voice clear and damning. He described how Grant Mercer had pressured him to alter trial results, how adverse events were reclassified, how deaths were attributed to unrelated causes. He detailed the financial incentives offered, the threats made when he resisted, the moral compromise he'd made and now regretted. I fabricated safety data that led to FDA approval of a dangerous device, he said, voice breaking. Patients trusted doctors who trusted my data. People died because I was too weak to say no. I have to live with that. But Grant Mercer orchestrated it, funded it, profited from it. He belongs in prison. The interview was devastating, credible, impossible to dismiss. Watching the news coverage, I felt strange disconnection from my own role in this. Reporters discussed the anonymous source who'd provided documents to the Western Ledger, speculating about motives, debating whether whistleblowers were heroes or traitors. They didn't know the source was a 32-year-old woman sitting in a studio apartment in Denver, eating takeout Chinese food and crying at the television. They didn't know about my mother or Ruth, or the storage container in Aurora. They didn't know this was personal, not principled. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who refused to let murder go unpunished. Maria called that night with updates. The DOJ wants to meet with you, she said. They need to verify chain of custody on the documents. Establish your credibility as a witness. I've negotiated terms. You'll have immunity for anything you might have done accessing or distributing the evidence. They're also interested in the surveillance you experienced, Daniel's role, Kayla's involvement. This is bigger than Atlas MedTech now. It's a conspiracy case. I felt my stomach tighten. Meeting with federal prosecutors made everything more real, transformed me from anonymous source to active participant. Are you ready for this? Maria asked gently. I thought about my mother driving home in the rain, brake lines cut, dying alone on I-35. Yes, I said. I'm ready. The meeting happened in a secure government building, me and Maria on one side of the table, 3 DOJ attorneys on the other. They were professional, focused, relentless in their questioning. They wanted every detail about how I'd obtained Ruth's evidence, where documents were stored, who else had access, how I could prove authenticity. I walked them through everything: the Locker 17 delivery, the flash drive contents, the Aurora storage container, Ruth's video, the bank safety deposit box. I showed them the letter Ruth had written, Daniel's surveillance reports, payment records from Whitfield Advisory. They took notes, asked follow-up questions, requested permission to seize the storage container as evidence. I agreed to everything. Then they asked about my mother's death. Tell us about Linda Vaughn, the lead attorney said. What do you know about the circumstances? I recounted the official accident report, the inconsistencies Ruth had documented, the brake line damage, the witness who saw another vehicle following her. The attorney made notes. We're reopening that investigation, he said, treating it as potential homicide. If we can connect Atlas MedTech to automotive tampering, that elevates charges significantly. Conspiracy to commit murder carries life sentences. I felt cold satisfaction hearing those words. Life sentences. Good. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified. Investigative shows dedicated full episodes to the scandal. Medical ethics experts gave interviews condemning the fraud. Patient advocacy groups called for Atlas MedTech's complete shutdown. Families of people who died with sentinel stents started coming forward, sharing stories, demanding answers. The human cost became impossible to ignore. A woman in Ohio, whose father died of complications attributed to heart disease, now questioning whether the stent failed. A man in Florida, whose wife suffered a stroke after device migration. A teenager in California, who'd needed emergency surgery when his stent dislodged. Each story added weight to the case, transformed abstract fraud into concrete harm. Atlas MedTech tried to fight back. They hired a crisis management firm that pushed counter-narratives, claiming the Western Ledger had relied on a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. They issued technical rebuttals to the safety concerns, arguing the complications were within acceptable statistical ranges. They attacked Dr. Caldwell's credibility, pointing out he'd participated in the alleged fraud and only came forward to save himself, but nothing stuck. The evidence was too overwhelming. Internal company emails leaked showing executives discussing the cover-up. More whistleblowers emerged, mid-level employees who'd witnessed data manipulation and stayed quiet out of fear. The dam had broken. I watched Daniel's name appear in news reports, identified as a consultant connected to the surveillance operation. Reporters found his payments from Whitfield Advisory, traced his relationship with me, uncovered his attendance at the conference where my mother was photographed. One article called him an operative embedded in the target's family, making our marriage sound like spy craft, which it had been. The comment sections filled with outrage. People called him a sociopath, a con artist, a murderer. I felt vindicated and empty simultaneously. Public condemnation didn't undo what he'd done to me. It didn't return the 4 years I'd wasted loving someone who'd never existed. Kayla tried to reach Maria's office, requesting a meeting, claiming she had information to share. Maria consulted with the DOJ attorneys before responding. They want to flip her, Maria told me. She's low-level enough that they'll offer a deal if her testimony helps build the case against Whitfield and Mercer. How do you feel about that? I thought about Kayla reporting on me for 3 years, documenting my life for people who'd killed my mother. I thought about her sleeping with Daniel, betraying me in the most personal way possible while pretending to be my friend. I wanted her to suffer, but I wanted Mercer and Whitfield more. If her testimony helps convict them, I said slowly, then offer the deal, but I never want to see her again. Maria nodded. Understood. The Senate hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, broadcasted live on C-SPAN and major networks. Grant Mercer was subpoenaed to testify, along with other Atlas MedTech executives and FDA officials who'd approved the Sentinel stent. Dr. Caldwell would testify remotely from protective custody, and I was invited to attend, seated in the gallery, visible to cameras but not speaking. Maria thought my presence would be powerful, a reminder that real people had been hurt by corporate fraud. I wasn't sure I could handle sitting in the same room as Mercer, even separated by security and cameras, but I agreed. My mother had died trying to stop him. The least I could do was watch him squirm under oath. The night before the hearing, I had another dream about my mother. We were in her office, surrounded by papers and files, her explaining something technical about medical devices while I half listened, more interested in checking my phone. In the dream, she grabbed my hand and said, "Rachel, pay attention. This matters. You need to understand this." I looked up and saw fear in her eyes, urgency, desperation. Then the dream shifted, and I was alone in the office, papers scattered everywhere, searching for something important I couldn't name. I woke at 3 a.m, heart pounding, face wet with tears. She'd tried to tell me. She'd known something was wrong, and I hadn't listened because I'd been too absorbed in my own life to notice hers was in danger. The Senate hearing room was exactly like you see on television, wood paneling and formal portraits, and rows of seats arranged in a semicircle facing the witness table. I sat in the 3rd row of the gallery, Maria beside me, watching senators file in with serious expressions designed for cameras. The room buzzed with journalists, activists, family members of patients who died, everyone waiting for Grant Mercer to appear. Security was tight, metal detectors at every entrance, armed guards stationed along the walls. They were taking the death threats seriously. Apparently Mercer had received dozens since the story broke, people promising violence if he wasn't held accountable. I understood the impulse, even if I didn't condone it. Mercer entered through a side door, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits. looking thinner than in the conference photo with my mother. His face was pale, tight with stress, eyes darting around the room nervously. He'd aged years in 2 weeks. Good. I felt Maria's hand squeeze mine gently as Mercer took his seat at the witness table, adjusting the microphone, conferring quietly with his attorneys. "This is it," Maria whispered. "Everything we've worked for comes down to the next 4 hours." I nodded, unable to speak, throat tight with anticipation and rage. Somewhere in this building, prosecutors were watching, evaluating his testimony, deciding which charges to file. Somewhere in protective custody, Dr. Caldwell was preparing to contradict whatever lies Mercer told. And somewhere in Texas, Daniel was probably watching too, calculating his own exposure, planning his own defense. The committee chairman gavelled the hearing to order and delivered opening remarks about corporate responsibility and public safety. Then he turned to Mercer with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Mercer, you're under oath. Did Atlas MedTech knowingly falsify clinical trial data for the Sentinel stent device?" Mercer leaned into the microphone, voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. "Senator, Atlas MedTech has always operated with the highest ethical standards. The allegations in recent media reports are false, based on documents taken out of context by individuals with financial motives to harm our company. Our clinical trials were conducted according to FDA regulations and independently verified. The Sentinel stent is safe and effective." I watched him lie with such smooth confidence and felt my hands curl into fists. Maria noticed and whispered, "Let him dig the hole deeper. Perjury adds years to the sentence." The questioning continued, senators taking turns pressing Mercer on specific details. "How do you explain the discrepancy between the trial data submitted to the FDA and the earlier versions obtained by the Western Ledger? How do you account for payments to consultants who surveilled a federal auditor? What was your relationship with Linda Vaughn?" Mercer deflected, obfuscated, claimed ignorance of operational details, blamed subordinates for any irregularities. His lawyers occasionally interjected, citing attorney-client privilege or advising him not to answer questions related to ongoing investigations. Then Senator Patricia Reeves from Massachusetts, a former prosecutor known for aggressive questioning, took her turn. She held up a printed email with Mercer's name in the from field. "Mr. Mercer, I'm looking at an email you sent to Dr. Harrison Caldwell on March 14th, 3 years ago. You wrote, and I quote, 'We need those adverse event numbers lower before FDA submission. Get creative with classifications, whatever it takes.' Did you send that email?" Mercer's face flushed. "I'd need to see the full context of that communication, Senator. That sounds like it's been taken out of context." Senator Reeves smiled coldly. "The full email chain is in the committee's possession, Mr. Mercer, along with 47 other emails where you explicitly directed staff to manipulate safety data. Are you saying these are all fabricated?" The room erupted in murmurs. Mercer conferred frantically with his lawyers. After a long moment, he returned to the microphone. "Senator, on advice of counsel, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declining to answer that question." The murmurs became shouts. Journalists scrambled to file updates. Senators exchanged glances. Invoking the Fifth in a Senate hearing was, essentially, an admission of guilt in the court of public opinion. Maria squeezed my hand again, harder this time, grinning. "Got him," she whispered. "He just destroyed whatever credibility he had left." The hearing continued with other witnesses. FDA officials testified about approval processes, admitting their review had relied heavily on data provided by Atlas MedTech without sufficient independent verification. They promised reforms, additional oversight, more rigorous auditing, but their bureaucratic language couldn't obscure the fundamental failure. They'd trusted a company that lied, and people had died because of that trust. Patient family members gave emotional testimony, describing loved ones who'd suffered complications or died after receiving the Sentinel stent. A woman from Ohio broke down crying while describing her father's final days, the pain he'd endured, the questions doctors couldn't answer about why his stent had failed. I cried watching her, thinking about my mother, about all the families destroyed by corporate greed. Dr. Caldwell testified via video link from an undisclosed location, his face still obscured, but his testimony devastating. He walked the committee through exactly how data manipulation occurred, which team members participated, how Mercer had personally approved changes that made dangerous devices appear safe. He provided dates, names, specific examples of emails and meetings where fraud was discussed openly. His voice shook as he admitted his own culpability, but his contrition seemed genuine. "I was wrong," he said. "I prioritized my career over patient safety. I'll regret that for the rest of my life." But Grant Mercer created the system that incentivized fraud. He knew exactly what was happening and encouraged it. After the hearing ended, Maria and I walked out into chaos. News crews packed the hallway, shouting questions at anyone who'd been inside. Protesters held signs demanding justice, chanting slogans about corporate accountability. I kept my head down, following Maria through the crowd to a waiting car. Back at her office, we watched cable news coverage showing highlights from the hearing on repeat. Legal analysts predicted criminal indictments within weeks. Medical ethics experts called for industry-wide reforms. Patient advocacy groups announced class action lawsuits. The story had reached critical mass, generating its own momentum, spreading faster than Atlas MedTech could contain it. That evening, my burner phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Rachel?" The voice was Kayla's, strained and desperate. "Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you." I felt my jaw tighten. "We have nothing to discuss, Kayla. You're talking to prosecutors. That's all that matters." "Wait," she said quickly. "I know you hate me. I know I can't fix what I did. But there's something you need to know about Daniel. He's planning something. I heard him on a call last night. He thinks if he eliminates certain evidence, he can claim he was just a consultant who didn't know about the fraud. Rachel, he mentioned your mother's files, the ones you're storing somewhere. I think he's going to try to destroy them." My blood went cold. "How do you know this? Why are you telling me?" "Because I'm done protecting him," Kayla said, voice breaking. "I thought we were partners, that after everything's settled, we'd be together. But he told me yesterday I'm expendable, that I need to take whatever deal the prosecutors offer and keep my mouth shut about his involvement with Whitfield. He used me the same way he used you, Rachel, the same way he uses everyone, and I'm scared he's going to hurt someone else to cover his tracks." I listened to her cry, feeling nothing but cold calculation. If Daniel went after the Aurora container, he'd find it empty. The DOJ had already seized everything as evidence, but that he was desperate enough to try meant he felt walls closing in. "I need you to tell the DOJ about this conversation," I said flatly. "Every detail about Daniel's plans. And Kayla," I paused, choosing words carefully, "whatever happens to you from this point forward, you earned it. You betrayed me for 3 years. You helped the people who killed my mother. I hope your deal includes prison time because you deserve to suffer." I hung up before she could respond and immediately called Maria. "She needs to be in protective custody," I said, after explaining the call. "If Daniel thinks she's talking too much, she's a liability." Maria agreed and made calls while I paced my apartment, adrenaline flooding my system. The next morning, news broke that Preston Whitfield had been arrested at Dulles Airport, attempting to board an international flight. Federal agents had caught him with fake passports and $2 million in cryptocurrency. The charges included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder for hire in connection with Linda Vaughn's death. Apparently, someone from his organization had flipped, provided evidence linking Whitfield directly to the automotive tampering that killed my mother. I read the news report 3 times, hands shaking, barely believing it. They were actually charging him with her murder. After 3 years of it being classified as an accident, finally someone acknowledged the truth. My mother had been murdered, and the man who'd ordered it was now in federal custody facing life in prison. I called Maria, voice breaking. "They're charging him for my mother." "I know," she said gently. "I just heard. Rachel, this is huge. If they can prove Whitfield ordered the hit and connect him to Atlas MedTech payments, that's conspiracy to commit murder. Mercer could face the same charges. Everyone involved in the cover-up becomes complicit in a homicide." I felt something crack open in my chest, grief and rage and relief pouring out simultaneously. For 3 years, I'd believed the official story, accepted that my mother died in a random accident. Even after finding Ruth's evidence, some part of me wondered if we were connecting dots that didn't exist. But this arrest confirmed everything, validated my mother's fear, Ruth's investigation, my determination to seek justice. They'd killed her, and now they'd pay. The DOJ moved faster than anyone expected, filing criminal indictments on a Friday afternoon, the kind of timing designed to dominate weekend news cycles. Grant Mercer was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Preston Whitfield faced murder for hire, conspiracy, witness tampering, and a dozen other counts. Dr. Harrison Caldwell's cooperation agreement was formalized, granting him immunity in exchange for testimony, and Daniel Brooks, along with 3 other Whitfield advisory operatives, was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and acting as unregistered agents in a criminal enterprise. I read the indictment documents Maria forwarded, each count detailed with supporting evidence, and felt satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. Arrest warrants were executed simultaneously across 4 states. Federal agents took Mercer into custody at his Boston home at 6 a.m. Footage leaked to news networks showing him in handcuffs being led to a waiting SUV. Whitfield remained in custody, denied bail as a flight risk. Daniel was arrested in Austin, at the apartment we'd once shared, the place where he'd betrayed me with Kayla. I watched that arrest footage obsessively, rewinding the moment agents pushed him against a wall to cuff him, searching his face for emotion. He looked calm, controlled, like this was an inconvenience rather than catastrophe. That coldness reminded me exactly who he was, not the man I'd married, because that man never existed. Just an operative caught doing his job. Maria scheduled a press conference for the following Monday, coordinating with the Western Ledger and the BI. DOJ to maximize impact. Rachel, she said during our preparation meeting, you don't have to speak if you're not ready. But the prosecutors think putting a face to the victim's family, letting people see you, understand what was taken from you, that will matter. Public opinion influences juries, judges, sentencing. Your testimony isn't just about facts. It's about making them feel the human cost. I understood what she was asking. Stop being anonymous. Step into the light. Become the public face of the scandal. The thought terrified me, but I'd come too far to hide now. The press conference was held in a hotel conference room in Denver. Cameras from every major network. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder. Maria spoke first, outlining the legal case, the charges, the evidence trail. Then she introduced me, Rachel Miller, daughter of Linda Vaughn, the federal auditor whose investigation into Atlas MedTech was cut short by murder. Rachel inherited evidence compiled by her mother and her Aunt Ruth Navarro, and made the courageous decision to bring that evidence to authorities despite personal risk. She's here today to share her story. I walked to the podium on legs that felt unstable, gripping the edges to steady myself, staring at the sea of cameras and faces. My name is Rachel Miller, I began, voice shaking despite my efforts to control it. 3 years ago, my mother died in what was classified as a car accident on I-35. I believed that story because I had no reason not to. My mother was a careful driver, a cautious person, someone who followed rules and did her job with integrity. But 6 months ago, I learned the truth. My mother discovered that Atlas MedTech was falsifying clinical trial data, putting patients at risk with dangerous medical devices. She was preparing to report her findings to the FDA when someone cut her brake lines and staged her death to look like an accident. I paused, swallowing hard. The room was completely silent. My Aunt Ruth spent 2 years collecting evidence to prove what happened, building a case against the people responsible. And then she died too, in another convenient accident that I now believe was murder. I looked directly into the nearest camera. For 6 months I've carried this evidence, working with prosecutors and journalists to ensure it saw daylight. I've watched these people lie on television, deny their crimes, pretend to be victims of a smear campaign. But the evidence doesn't lie. The emails, the recordings, the financial records, the testimony of people who participated in the fraud, it all points to systematic conspiracy to defraud regulators and harm patients. My voice grew stronger. Grant Mercer, Preston Whitfield, Daniel Brooks, and everyone else involved in this conspiracy, they didn't just commit fraud, they committed murder. They killed my mother because she threatened their profits. They killed my aunt because she sought justice, and they would have killed me too if they'd known what I was planning. The questions came rapid fire after that. How did you obtain the evidence? Are you in protective custody? What do you want to see happen to the defendants? I answered carefully, following Maria's coaching, focusing on facts rather than emotion, though emotion bled through anyway. When a reporter asked how I felt about Daniel's arrest, I paused for a long moment. Daniel Brooks spent 4 years pretending to love me while spying on my family for the people who murdered my mother, I said, quietly. He married me as part of his assignment. Every moment of our relationship was a lie designed to give him access to information that could be used against us. How do I feel about his arrest? I feel like justice is finally possible, but nothing will give me back the years he stole or undo the trauma of discovering the person you trusted most was your enemy. After the press conference, my face was everywhere. News segments profiled me as the daughter who'd exposed her mother's killers. Social media exploded with support and conspiracy theories in equal measure. Some people called me brave, a hero, an inspiration. Others claimed I was part of a coordinated attack on the medical device industry, funded by competitors or trial lawyers. The attention was overwhelming, invasive, exhausting. Strangers recognized me at coffee shops. Reporters camped outside Maria's office. I received hundreds of messages, some supportive, some threatening, all from people who felt entitled to my story. Privacy became impossible. The trial date was set for 4 months out, giving both sides time to prepare. Maria warned me the defense would be vicious, that they'd investigate every aspect of my life looking for ammunition to discredit me. They'll claim you're motivated by money, by revenge, by mental instability, she said. They'll bring up the divorce, suggest you're a scorned woman making false accusations. They'll twist everything. You need to be prepared for character assassination. I told her I was ready, but truthfully, I wasn't sure. How do you prepare for strangers dissecting your life, questioning your motives, calling you a liar in front of the world? But the alternative was letting them win, and that wasn't an option. Discovery revealed more damning evidence. Atlas MedTech's servers contained deleted emails that IT forensics recovered, showing executives discussing how to handle the Linda Vaughn problem weeks before her death. Whitfield's financial records showed a payment of $85,000 to an operative with automotive expertise, dated 5 days before my mother's crash. Daniel's surveillance reports were even more detailed than what Ruth had found, documenting not just my activities but my emotional state, vulnerabilities he could exploit, strategies for maintaining control. Reading them felt like psychological violation. He'd studied me like a lab specimen, documented my fears and insecurities, shared intimate details with his handlers. The betrayal cut deeper each time I encountered new evidence of his manipulation. Kayla's cooperation agreement was finalized. She provided testimony about the internal workings of Atlas MedTech's accounting fraud, how money was moved to hide payments to Whitfield Advisory, how bonuses were structured to reward executives who met data manipulation targets. In exchange, she'd plead guilty to conspiracy and serve 18 months in minimum security. The leniency infuriated me. 18 months for 3 years of betrayal, for helping the people who killed my mother. But Maria reminded me that Kayla's testimony would help convict Mercer and Whitfield, and that was worth the trade. Justice isn't about revenge, she said. It's about stopping them from hurting anyone else. 2 weeks before trial, I received a letter forwarded through Maria's office. The return address was the federal detention center where Daniel was being held. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. Inside, 3 pages in Daniel's precise handwriting. Rachel, it began. I know you have no reason to believe anything I say. I know I destroyed your trust beyond repair, but I want you to understand that I never intended for things to go this far. When Whitfield hired me to monitor your family, I was told it was routine corporate intelligence, nothing illegal, just keeping tabs on a difficult auditor. I didn't know about the plans for your mother. I didn't know about Ruth. By the time I realized what I'd gotten involved in, I was too deep to extract myself without consequences. I read the letter with cold detachment, recognizing the manipulation even in his attempts at explanation. He wanted me to believe he was a victim too, caught up in something beyond his control, just following orders, the same excuse war criminals used at Nuremberg. The letter continued with apologies that rang hollow, expressions of regret that meant nothing, and a final paragraph asking if I could find it in my heart to forgive him someday. I laughed out loud reading that last part, harsh sound in my empty apartment. Forgive him? The man who'd married me as an assignment, who'd reported on me to my mother's killers, who'd stood by while Ruth was murdered. I would watch him go to prison and feel nothing but satisfaction. The trial started on a Monday morning in federal court, downtown Boston, the building surrounded by protesters and news crews and security barricades. I sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table, positioned so the jury would see me every time they looked toward the attorneys, a constant reminder that real people had been hurt by the defendant's actions. Grant Mercer entered first, thinner than during the Senate hearing, wearing an expensive suit that hung loose on his frame. He didn't look at me. Preston Whitfield came next, older, harder, with cold eyes that scanned the courtroom like he was assessing threats. He looked directly at me for 3 seconds, expression unreadable, before taking his seat. Daniel was last, flanked by federal marshals, and when his eyes found mine, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine fear. Good. He should be afraid. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the conspiracy in devastating detail. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about greed," the lead prosecutor said. "A woman named Jennifer Castellano, with 20 years of experience prosecuting corporate crime. Greed so profound that it led to fraud, to cover-up, and ultimately to murder. The evidence will show that Atlas MedTech, under Grant Mercer's leadership, systematically falsified clinical trial data to gain FDA approval for a dangerous medical device. When federal auditor Linda Vaughn discovered this fraud, the defendants conspired to silence her permanently. They hired Preston Whitfield, who arranged automotive tampering that caused Ms. Vaughn's death. They embedded Daniel Brooks in her family to monitor what information she'd shared. And when her sister Ruth Navarro continued the investigation, they killed her too. This isn't a case about business competition or regulatory disagreement. This is a case about murder for profit. The defense tried to counter by claiming the deaths were accidents, that any data discrepancies were honest mistakes, that the prosecution was criminalizing normal business practices. Mercer's attorney, a silver-haired man named Richard Thornton, argued that his client was a visionary entrepreneur being scapegoated for industry-wide problems. Atlas MedTech operated within standard practices, he said. Every medical device company makes judgment calls about data interpretation. Mr. Mercer relied on expert advice from qualified researchers. If mistakes were made, they were made in good faith, not criminal intent. The jury looked skeptical. Good faith doesn't include emails saying get creative with classifications and whatever it takes. The prosecution called Dr. Caldwell first, their star witness, appearing via secure video link. He walked the jury through the data falsification process step by step, showing original trial results alongside the altered versions submitted to FDA. "Here you can see we had 3 patient deaths directly attributable to device failure," he testified, pointing to a spreadsheet on screen. "In the original data, these are clearly marked as adverse events caused by stent migration and thrombosis. But in the version submitted to FDA, those same deaths are classified as unrelated cardiac events. The cause of death coding was changed without medical justification. When the prosecutor asked who directed those changes, Caldwell answered without hesitation. Grant Mercer personally instructed me to reclassify the deaths. He said the company couldn't afford delays from additional safety reviews. The defense cross-examined aggressively, trying to portray Caldwell as an unreliable narrator who'd participated in fraud and now blamed others to save himself. But Caldwell remained steady, admitting his own culpability while maintaining that Mercer had orchestrated everything. "I was wrong to follow his instructions," he said. "But make no mistake, Grant Mercer knew exactly what he was asking me to do. He understood the data was being falsified. He approved it. He profited from it." The jury took extensive notes during his testimony. Several glanced at Mercer with expressions of disgust. FBI forensic accountants testified. Next, tracing money from Atlas MedTech through shell companies to Whitfield Advisory, then to specific operatives including Daniel. The financial trail was meticulously documented, every transaction dated and sourced. Impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "Here's a payment of $47,000 to Daniel Brooks," the accountant said, highlighting a transfer on screen. The invoice description says, "Relationship cultivation and intelligence gathering." The date corresponds exactly with when Mr. Brooks began dating Rachel Miller, Linda Vaughn's daughter. This wasn't a consulting fee for legitimate services. This was payment for surveillance and infiltration of the target's family. When the prosecution called me to testify, I felt time slow down, walking to the witness stand, raising my right hand, swearing to tell the truth, sitting down and facing the jury. All of it felt surreal. Jennifer Castellano approached with a kind expression. "Ms. Miller, can you tell the jury about your relationship with your mother?" I took a breath and began. "My mother was my hero," I said simply. "She was brilliant, principled, brave. She worked as a technical auditor reviewing medical device data for FDA compliance. She took that work seriously because she understood that accurate data meant patient safety. When she discovered problems with Atlas MedTech's trial results, she didn't ignore them. She documented everything, followed protocol, prepared to report her findings. Because that's who she was, someone who did the right thing even when it was difficult. Tell us about the last time you spoke with her, Jennifer prompted gently. It was 2 days before she died, I said, voice catching. She called me from her office, said she was working on something important that might take a while to resolve. She sounded stressed, but determined. I asked if she was okay and she said yes, just dealing with some complicated issues at work. I told her I loved her and she said she loved me too. I paused, composing myself. If I'd known that was the last conversation we'd ever have, I would have said more. I would have told her how proud I was of her courage. I would have begged her to be careful, but I didn't know. I thought we had time. The defense attorney, Thornton, cross-examined me with barely concealed hostility. Ms. Miller, isn't it true that you received over $2 million from your aunt's estate, contingent on pursuing this case? I met his eyes steadily. That's not accurate. My Aunt Ruth created trusts in my name to ensure I had financial resources to fight back against powerful people. The money wasn't contingent on anything. It was protection. So you had a financial incentive to build a case against Atlas MedTech, he pressed. I had a justice incentive, I corrected. My mother was murdered. My aunt was murdered. The money just meant I could afford to take time away from work to see them held accountable. Would you have preferred I was too broke to seek justice? Thornton shifted tactics. You claim you and Mr. Brooks were married, but isn't it true you were separated and going through a contentious divorce when these allegations emerged? We were separated because I discovered him in bed with my best friend, I said flatly. The divorce was contentious because he was trying to steal assets while concealing that he'd married me under false pretenses as part of a surveillance operation. Those aren't unrelated facts. He married me to spy on my family. For your client. Thornton tried to interrupt, but I continued. Every moment of our relationship was a lie. Every intimate conversation was reported to his handlers. Every vulnerability I shared was documented and analyzed. So yes, I was angry when I found out. Wouldn't you be? The jury looked sympathetic. Thornton changed subjects again, asking about my employment history, my mental health, trying to find angles to attack my credibility, but the prosecution had prepared me well. I answered, calmly, acknowledged difficulties without apologizing for them, maintained composure even when questions became insulting. When Thornton finally dismissed me, I walked back to my seat feeling exhausted but vindicated. I'd told my truth. The jury had listened. That was all I could do. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played the audio recording of Whitfield discussing automotive intervention with an operative. The conversation was coded but clear enough. The target is driving I-35. Regularly, Whitfield's voice said on the tape. Weather forecast shows rain Thursday night. That's your window. Make it look like hydroplaning. Clean up afterwards. No loose ends. The operative confirmed understanding. Payment on completion, same as last time. The courtroom went completely silent listening to that exchange. Several jurors looked physically ill. This was a man casually ordering murder, discussing killing someone like it was a routine business transaction. Whitfield's attorney tried to claim the audio was taken out of context, that automotive intervention could mean many things, that there was no direct evidence linking that conversation to Linda Vaughn's death. But the prosecutor demolished that argument. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, this recording was made 6 days before Linda Vaughn died. The reference to I-35 matches her regular commute route. The weather forecast mentioned matches the night she crashed. And financial records show Whitfield made a payment of $85,000 to the operative on this recording, 2 days after Ms. Vaughn's death, exactly as discussed. How many coincidences are we supposed to accept before we acknowledge the obvious? This was a murder for hire, and Preston Whitfield ordered it. When Daniel took the stand in his own defense, I forced myself to watch. He claimed he'd believed he was conducting legitimate corporate intelligence, that he'd been told Linda Vaughn was leaking proprietary information to competitors, that monitoring her family was standard due diligence. I never knew about plans to harm anyone, he testified. I was told to build a relationship with Rachel, gather information about what her mother might have shared with her. I developed genuine feelings for her. Our marriage wasn't entirely strategic. I cared about her. I almost laughed at that last part. The prosecution destroyed him on cross-examination, walking him through surveillance reports he'd written describing our intimate life in clinical detail, showing emails where he'd discussed strategy for maintaining my emotional dependence, revealing recordings where he'd joked with handlers about manipulating me. By the time they finished, he looked exactly like what he was, a mercenary who'd sold intimacy for money. The closing arguments lasted 2 days. The prosecution built a comprehensive narrative connecting every piece of evidence, every witness, every document into an undeniable pattern of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative explanations, attacking witness credibility, claiming prosecutorial overreach, but the evidence was too strong, the paper trail too clear, the audio too damning. When the jury retired to deliberate, Maria squeezed my shoulder. "You did everything you could," she said. "Now we wait." The waiting was agony. 3 days of obsessively checking my phone for updates, barely sleeping, running through scenarios in my head. What if they acquitted? What if all this effort, all this pain, resulted in nothing? On the 4th day, the jury sent word they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when the verdict was read, every seat filled, standing room only in the back, the air thick with anticipation and held breath. I sat in my usual spot, Maria on one side, Sarah Chen from the Western Ledger on the other, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. The jury filed in, looking serious, faces unreadable, taking their seats without glancing at the defendants. "That's a good sign," Maria whispered. "Juries that convict don't look at defendants. Juries that acquit do." I nodded but couldn't speak, throat too tight, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. The foreperson stood when the judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the verdict forms and handed them to the judge, who reviewed them silently before returning them to be read aloud. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find the defendant Grant Mercer?" "Guilty." "On the charge of wire fraud?" "Guilty." "On the charge of obstruction of justice?" "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. People gasped, cheered, started crying. The judge gavelled for order, but the noise continued. I sat frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard. Guilty on all counts. Grant Mercer was going to prison. The verdicts continued. Preston Whitfield, guilty on murder for hire, conspiracy, witness tampering, every single charge. The jury had seen through his cold denials, recognized him for exactly what he was, a killer for profit, a man who'd orchestrated my mother's death and Ruth's death without remorse or hesitation. Daniel Brooks, guilty on conspiracy and fraud, though acquitted on the most serious charges because his attorneys successfully argued he'd been a pawn rather than architect. Still, he was looking at 15 years minimum. Kayla, who'd taken her plea deal, would serve her 18 months starting next week. Dr. Caldwell, protected by his immunity agreement, was already in witness protection with a new identity. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Grant Mercer received 43 years in federal prison, without possibility of parole. The judge was harsh in her remarks. "You betrayed the public trust in the most egregious way possible," she said. "You falsified safety data that led to patient deaths. You conspired to murder a federal auditor doing her job. You showed no remorse, no accountability, no recognition of the harm you caused. The sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and ensures you'll spend the rest of your life in prison." Mercer stood stone-faced, but I saw his hands trembling. Preston Whitfield got life without parole plus 75 years. The judge called him one of the most dangerous defendants to appear in her courtroom, a man who killed casually and would kill again if given opportunity. Daniel's eye. Sentencing was the one I attended in person. I wanted him to see my face when he learned his fate. The judge gave him 19 years, calling his betrayal of trust particularly insidious. "You didn't just commit fraud," the judge said. "You weaponized intimacy. You married a woman to spy on her family, documented her vulnerabilities, reported her private life to people who meant her harm. That level of calculated manipulation demonstrates profound moral bankruptcy." Before the marshals led him away, Daniel looked directly at me. I couldn't read his expression. Regret? Defiance? Emptiness? I didn't care anymore. He was a stranger who'd worn my husband's face. Whatever he felt now was irrelevant to me. The civil settlements came next. Atlas MedTech filed for bankruptcy, its assets liquidated to create a victim compensation fund worth approximately $800 million. Patients who'd received the Sentinel stent and experienced complications could file claims. Families of patients who died could file wrongful death claims. The FDA ordered a complete recall and issued new regulations requiring independent verification of all clinical trial data. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were something. My mother's death had exposed flaws in the system. Maybe her sacrifice would prevent future tragedies. I used the wrongful death settlement for my mother, $3 million, to establish the Linda Vaughn Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers in the medical device industry. We provided legal defense, financial assistance, secure communication channels, and protection services for anyone trying to expose fraud or safety violations. Ruth would have loved it. The Foundation's first case was a researcher at another medical device company who discovered falsified data similar to what my mother found. We got her evidence to regulators before the company could silence her. The device never made it to market. Lives were saved, with my own. Money from Ruth's trusts. I created the Navarro Institute for Clinical Data Integrity, a nonprofit that audited medical research and flagged inconsistencies for regulatory review. We hired former FDA auditors, statistical analysts, medical ethicists, people who understood how to spot manipulation and had the courage to call it out. The Institute operated on a simple principle that my mother and Ruth had lived by. Truth matters more than profit. Safety matters more than speed. And some lines should never be crossed no matter the financial incentive. Within 2 years, we'd reviewed over 200 clinical trials and flagged 47 with serious data integrity issues. Not all of them were fraud. Some were honest mistakes, but all of them needed correction before patients were put at risk. I moved permanently to Denver, bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, adopted a dog named Justice because the shelter volunteer said it fit. My life was simpler now, quieter, but full of purpose. I woke each morning and went to the Institute office, worked with brilliant people who cared about the same things I did, came home to a dog who loved me without agenda or manipulation. I dated occasionally but kept relationships superficial. Trust was still difficult. Maybe it always would be, but I was okay with that. Being alone and safe felt better than being partnered and vulnerable. Kayla served her 18 months and sent a letter when she was released, asking if we could talk, if there was any path to forgiveness. I never responded. Some betrayals are too deep to repair, some relationships too poisoned to resurrect. I didn't wish her harm, but I also didn't want her in my life in any capacity. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed her. She'd have to find peace with her choices on her own. Daniel wrote occasionally from prison, letters I threw away unopened. Whatever he wanted to say, I didn't want to hear it. He'd already taken enough of my time and energy. I wouldn't give him any more. 3 years after the trial, I returned to the storage container in Aurora one last time. Most of the contents had been seized as evidence or transferred to secure archive, but I'd been allowed to keep some personal items. Photos of my mother and Ruth together, smiling, alive. My mother's notebooks filled with technical observations and careful analysis. Ruth's letter explaining everything, the one that started this entire journey. I packed them carefully and brought them to the Institute, where I created a memorial display in the lobby. Photos, documents, a plaque that read Linda Vaughn and Ruth Navarro, auditors who refused to stay silent. Visitors to the Institute would see them first thing, understand who we were honoring, why this work mattered. I also kept the key from locker 17 and mounted it in a shadow box on my office wall, along with a photo of the brown box it had opened that night in the co-living building. That key changed everything. It gave me tools. I needed to fight back, resources to sustain the battle, evidence to prove truth. Sometimes when work felt overwhelming or progress too slow, I looked at that key and remembered the moment I opened the locker. The shock, the fear, the cold determination that settled over me when I realized what Ruth had left me. That determination never went away. It just evolved into something sustainable, a commitment to justice that would last the rest of my life. The Institute hosted an annual gala, fundraiser, where we honored whistleblowers who'd exposed corporate malfeasance at personal cost. The third year, we created the Ruth Navarro Courage Award, given to someone who'd risked everything to tell truth. The recipient was a quality control manager who'd documented contamination in surgical instruments and reported it despite threats from his employer. Standing at the podium presenting the award, I talked about Ruth's final years, how she'd worked in secret to build a case against my mother's killers, how she'd protected assets and compiled evidence knowing it might cost her life. She understood that some fights are worth dying for, I said. But more importantly, she understood that some fights are worth living for, worth dedicating years of careful work, tedious documentation, strategic planning. Ruth taught me that justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up every day and refusing to quit. I thought about my mother often, wondered what she'd think of everything I'd built from the ashes of her death. Would she be proud? Would she think I'd done enough? Would she forgive me for not noticing she was in danger? I'd never know the answers to those questions, but I knew she'd taught me to value truth, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult, to believe that one person could make a difference if they were brave enough to try. Those lessons guided everything I did. The institute, the foundation, my entire life after the trial. All of it was built on principles she'd instilled in me long before I understood why they mattered. 5 years after Locker 17, I was invited to speak at a medical ethics conference in Boston. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of doctors, researchers, industry executives, I told my story. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just factually. My mother discovered fraud, reported it, and was murdered for it. My aunt compiled evidence and was murdered for it. I finished what they started, and now the people responsible are in prison. The system that enabled them has been reformed. But reform isn't permanent. It requires constant vigilance, constant courage, constant willingness to speak up when you see something wrong. After my speech, a young researcher approached me, nervous, clutching a folder. "I think my company is falsifying trial data," she whispered. "I don't know what to do. I'm scared." I gave her my card and said, "Call me tomorrow. We'll figure it out together." That's what we do. If you're watching this and you've ever felt powerless against people with more money, more resources, more power, I want you to know something. You're not as powerless as they want you to believe. Evidence matters, truth matters, persistence matters. My mother was one auditor who discovered one fraud. Ruth was one woman with file folders and determination. I was one grieving daughter who opened a locker and found a key. None of us were special or extraordinary. We were just people who refused to accept that wrong was right, that murder was accident, that powerful people were untouchable, and that refusal changed everything. The key to Locker 17 still hangs in my office. Reminder that sometimes life changes when you open the right door at the right moment. But more importantly, reminder that what you do after opening that door is what actually matters. I could have taken Ruth's money and disappeared. I could have stayed silent and safe, but I chose differently. I chose to fight, to finish what they started, to transform grief into purpose and rage into justice. That choice cost me years of my life, my sense of safety, my ability to trust easily. But it also gave me something invaluable, the certainty that when faced with the hardest decision of my life, I chose right. So if this story resonates with you, if you're facing your own impossible decision about whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to fight or flee, whether to risk everything for truth, I can't tell you what to choose. But I can tell you that 3 years ago, I stood in a shabby co-living room, holding $70,000 and evidence of murder, and I had to decide who I wanted to be. I chose to be someone who finishes what her family started, someone who refuses to let killers win, someone who believes that one person, armed with truth and determination, can actually change things. I've never regretted that choice, not for one single day. Thank you for listening. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. Share it if you think someone needs to hear it. And remember, justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people make it happen, one brave choice at a time.